It started with an invitation that didn't sit right. My stepfather, Ron, called me one Friday afternoon. He asked if I could swing by for a beer later in the week. That wasn't unusual. Ron had been a part of my life since I was 15, when he married my mom. Over the years, our bond grew solid. He was the guy I went to for advice about buying a car or fixing a leaky faucet. But this time, his tone was odd, casual but clipped. When I said I'd be busy with work that week, he insisted, "Just stop by for 10 minutes. It's important." I agreed reluctantly, but something about it didn't sit right. Later that evening, I mentioned it to my wife, Anna. She and I had been married for 7 years. "Ron wants me to come over." "Not sure what for," I said. She froze, just for a second, before her face slipped back into a calm smile. "Maybe he wants to talk about your mom's birthday next month," she offered. Her explanation was reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her pause meant something more. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed strange reactions from Anna. Over the last few months, she'd grown distant. Our conversations became surface level, punctuated by her checking her phone more often than before. When I asked about it, she waved it off. "Just work stress," she'd say, or "You're imagining things." But her laughter felt forced, her affection sporadic. By the time I finally sat across from Ron in his dimly lit den, nursing a cold beer, the unease had started to harden into suspicion. Something was going on. I just didn't know what. And I didn't know that I was about to find out in the worst way possible. Ron was unusually quiet. He stared into his beer bottle, swirling the liquid inside like it held answers he was struggling to find. I waited, letting the awkward silence stretch. This was his meeting, after all. I wasn't going to pry it out of him. Finally, he sighed. "Look, Mark," he started, his voice hesitant. "I wanted to talk to you about something delicate." My mind immediately jumped to my mom. Was she sick? Was their marriage in trouble? I braced myself. "What is it?" "It's about Anna," he said. My stomach tightened, and I suddenly felt like I was in free fall. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly trying to choose his words with care. "Has she mentioned anything to you about, needing advice?" "From me?" he asked. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Advice? About what?" Ron scratched the back of his head, clearly flustered. Look, I don't want to cause trouble where there might not be any. It's just that, she's been coming over sometimes when you're at work. To talk." I blinked, my mind trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean, coming over?" "For what?" "To vent, I guess," he said quickly, as though trying to put a lid on a pot about to boil over. "It's nothing serious. Just, you know how women are sometimes. Needing someone to talk to." Something about the way he said it felt wrong. Too rehearsed. Too defensive. I stared at him, trying to gauge the truth in his expression. His face was flushed, his words rushed, and his avoidance of my eyes was telling. "You're saying Anna's been coming here to talk to you?" I asked slowly, trying to wrap my head around this absurd scenario. "Yeah, that's all it is," Ron replied. But the crack in his voice betrayed him. I leaned back in the chair, my beer forgotten. My pulse was pounding now, and the room suddenly felt stifling. "Ron," I said, my voice low and deliberate, "is there something you're not telling me?" The silence that followed spoke louder than any denial he could have given. Ron's silence stretched, and I felt my temper flare. "Ron," I pressed, leaning forward, "if you know something, just spit it out." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and uncertain, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of fear on his face. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. I narrowed my eyes. "What do I think?" He opened his mouth to answer but stopped short, as if he realized that anything he said would only dig a deeper hole. His hesitation was maddening. "That's it," I said, standing abruptly. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. "If you're not going to tell me what's going on, I'll find out myself." As I turned to leave, Ron grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "You're right. There's more to it." I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. Anna," he stammered. "She started showing up a couple of months ago. Said you two were having issues." "Which issues?" I snapped, not bothering to hide my irritation. He paused, his gaze flicking everywhere but at me. She didn't really say much, just talked about how you'd been distant, how things weren't the same between you two anymore. She said she felt alone. Bullshit. I spat, stepping closer. Anna and I were fine. We hit a rough patch, sure, but nothing serious. I thought so too, Ron admitted, his voice almost pleading. I thought she just needed a friend. There it was again, that forced innocence. A red flag waved in my mind. Ron wasn't telling me everything, but he was telling me enough to know something was seriously off. You're not giving me the full story, Ron, I said, pointing a finger at him. Why would Anna come to you of all people? What's going on? He swallowed hard, his face pale. Mark, I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen. The words hung in the air, jagged and heavy. I froze, the pieces suddenly clicking into place in a way that left me breathless. What the hell does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His silence was the confirmation I didn't want. And yet, part of me had already known. The late nights, the excuses, the growing distance between Anna and me. It all led back to this moment. Ron, I whispered, staring at him in disbelief. Are you sleeping with my wife? His face crumbled under the weight of his guilt. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. And that was all the answer I needed. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as Ron's silence confirmed what I had feared. I stood frozen, the sting of betrayal washing over me in waves. Say it, I demanded, my voice low and trembling. I want to hear you say it. Mark, say it. I roared, stepping closer, my fists clenched. Ron flinched at the force of my words, but finally looked up, his face etched with shame. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered. It got out of hand. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Out of hand? That's all you've got? How long, Ron? How long has this been going on? He hesitated, as if trying to calculate an answer that would hurt the least. A couple of months, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. A couple of months, I repeated, the words hollow in my mouth. My mind raced, connecting dots that now seemed so obvious. Her sudden need for space, the extra effort she put into her appearance before running errands, the late nights with vague explanations. And all this time, it had been with him, the man I had trusted, the man who had been a father figure to me. You're my stepfather, I spat, the words thick with disgust. You're supposed to have my back, not stab me in it. Mark, I'm sorry, Ron said, his voice cracking. It was a mistake. We didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and raw. You didn't mean to hurt me? Are you serious? You didn't think screwing my wife behind my back would hurt me? He looked at the floor, unable to answer. My thoughts shifted to Anna. Had she been here earlier today? Was that why he had called me over? To cover his tracks? Does Mom know? I asked coldly. Ron's head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. No, he said quickly. And she doesn't need to. This is between us, Mark. Please, don't drag her into this. The audacity of his request nearly made me laugh again. You're unbelievable, I said, shaking my head. You think you get to dictate how this plays out? He reached for my arm again, his desperation palpable. Mark, please, he begged. Let me fix this. I yanked my arm away. Fix this? I repeated, my voice icy. There's no fixing this, Ron. You broke it. You broke everything. I turned on my heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. My pulse was pounding, and my chest ached with the weight of what I'd just uncovered. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in my life would ever be the same. The drive home was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My thoughts raced, bouncing between rage and despair. How could they do this? How could she do this? When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. Our house. The place we'd made a home, filled with laughter and plans for the future. Now, it felt like a facade, a set piece in a play where I'd been the fool. I walked through the door, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Anna was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred something on the stove. She turned when she heard me come in, her face lighting up in a smile that quickly faltered when she saw my expression. "Mark? What's wrong?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat, heavy with betrayal. I stared at her, wondering how she could look so normal, so composed, after what I'd just learned. "Were you at Ron's today?" I finally asked, my voice low and strained. She blinked, her confusion seeming genuine. "No. Why?" "Don't lie to me, Anna," I snapped, my tone sharper than I intended. Her brow furrowed. "What's going on, Mark? Why are you asking me that?" "I just came from there," I said, stepping closer. "I know what's been going on. You and Ron." "I know." Her face paled, and for a split second, I saw something flash in her eyes. Guilt, panic, or maybe both. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You lied to me," I continued, my voice trembling with anger. "You lied to me every single day while you were sneaking around with him." "Mark, she stammered, her eyes welling with tears. "Don't you dare cry," I said, my voice cold. "You don't get to play the victim here." She took a step toward me, her hands outstretched. "It wasn't like that," she pleaded. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Spare me the excuses," I shouted, cutting her off. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You chose this, Anna. You chose to betray me." She crumbled then, sinking into a chair and burying her face in her hands. Her sobs filled the silence, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had trusted with my heart. And I realized that the person sitting in front of me wasn't the same person I had married. "I trusted you," I said quietly, the words heavy with pain. "I loved you, and this is what you do to me." She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered. "I don't know what else to say." I shook my head, the final threads of my patience snapping. "There's nothing left to say, Anna," I said, my voice hollow. "You've already said enough." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. My mind was already working on what came next. A confrontation was one thing, but there was a life to untangle, a marriage to end. I knew the road ahead would be messy, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay in this house, not tonight. Not with her. I left the house without another word, driving aimlessly through the quiet streets. The headlights of passing cars blurred in my vision as the reality of what had just unfolded settled like a weight in my chest. When I finally pulled over, I found myself at a park we used to visit together. It was where Anna and I had picnicked on lazy Sundays and talked about our dreams. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of everything that had been destroyed. I sat on a bench, gripping my phone, the urge to talk to someone, anyone, building with every passing second. But who would I call? My mom? No. The thought of breaking her heart with this news made me sick. A friend? Most of mine were mutual friends with Anna, and I wasn't ready to expose this to the world yet. After a deep breath, I opened my contacts and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My old college roommate, Kyle. We drifted apart over time, but he had always been someone I could count on for blunt honesty. "Mark." Kyle answered, his voice groggy. It was late, and I realized I hadn't even checked the time. "Man, it's been forever. What's up?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. "Hey, Kyle. Sorry for calling so late. I need to talk to someone." He was silent for a beat, then said, "Yeah, of course. What's going on?" The floodgates opened, and I told him everything. About Anna, about Ron, about how my entire world had just imploded. Kyle listened without interrupting, his silence steady and grounding. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Man, I don't even know what to say. That's some next-level betrayal." "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't know what to do. I can't go back there. Not tonight." "You shouldn't," he agreed. "Look, I know we haven't talked in a while, but my couch is always open. Come crash here. We'll figure this out." Relief flooded through me. Thanks, Kyle. I owe you one. Don't mention it. Just get here safe, okay? I hung up and drove to Kyle's place, my thoughts a chaotic storm. By the time I arrived, he was waiting at the door with a blanket and a beer. You look like hell, he said, his tone light but his eyes full of concern. Feels like it, I replied, managing a weak smile. We sat in his living room, the beer untouched in my hand as Kyle pressed for details. What's the plan? He asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. Divorce, obviously. But there's so much to untangle. The house, the finances. My voice trailed off, the weight of it all threatening to crush me. Kyle nodded thoughtfully. One step at a time. First, you need to get your head straight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the legal stuff. For now, just breathe. For the first time all night, I let myself exhale. Kyle was right. There was a mountain to climb, but I didn't have to scale it all at once. As I stretched out on his couch, the anger and betrayal still burning in my chest, I found a sliver of solace. I wasn't alone in this mess, and that was something. The next morning, sunlight streaming through the blinds jolted me awake. For a moment, I forgot where I was, but the sight of Kyle's cramped but familiar living room brought it all back. The events of the night before crashed over me like a wave, and I groaned, covering my face with my hands. Kyle was already up, a cup of coffee waiting on the table for me. Rough night? He asked, handing me the mug. Something like that, I said, my voice raspy. We sat in silence for a while, the caffeine doing little to dispel the fog in my head. Eventually, Kyle leaned forward, his expression serious. You need to start documenting everything, he said. Documenting? He nodded. If this is heading for divorce, and let's be honest, it is, you need to protect yourself, gather evidence, talk to a lawyer, and make sure you've got your side of the story locked down. It made sense, but the thought of diving deeper into the mess made my stomach churn. Still, I knew he was right. I spent most of the day on my phone, combing through old text messages and emails, looking for any hint of Anna's affair. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual exchanges about groceries, work, and weekend plans. But then I noticed a pattern. In the weeks leading up to when Ron claimed the affair began, Anna had started texting him more frequently. At first, it seemed innocent, questions about birthday plans for my mom or casual updates. But as the months went on, the messages became more cryptic. Phrases like, I really need to talk, and can we meet at the usual place, stood out like neon signs. The betrayal hit me all over again, not just because of the affair itself, but because they hadn't even bothered to hide it well. Did they think I was stupid, or did they just not care? I saved screenshots of the messages and backed them up to a secure folder. With every click, I felt more resolved. This wasn't just about ending my marriage, it was about reclaiming my dignity. Later that evening, I called my mom. I hadn't planned to involve her yet, but the weight of what I knew was too much to carry alone. Mark, she answered, her voice bright as always. Is everything okay? No, Mom, I said, my throat tightening. It's not. I need to talk to you about Ron. Her silence on the other end was deafening. What about Ron? She asked carefully. I hesitated, unsure of how to break the news gently. But then I realized there was no gentle way to say it. He's been having an affair with Anna, I said bluntly. The gasp on the other end of the line made my chest ache. What? Mark, are you sure? I'm sure, I said. I confronted him last night. He admitted it. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was trembling. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Mom, I said. I just thought you should know. I can't stay silent about this. The call ended with promises to talk more in person, but the conversation left me feeling hollow. Telling my mom was necessary, but it also made everything feel more real. That night, as I lay back on Kyle's couch, I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning. The road ahead was daunting, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them dictate the terms of my life anymore. It was time to take control. The next day brought a flurry of activity. After the bomb I dropped on my mom, I knew I couldn't wait to take the next steps. Kyle and I spent the morning researching divorce lawyers. By lunchtime, I had an appointment set up for later that week. Despite the forward momentum, dread hung over me. My mom had called 3 times already, each voicemail more frantic than the last. I hadn't answered. The guilt of pulling her into this nightmare gnawed at me, but I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. As I sat with Kyle, eating a half-hearted lunch, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my mom. It was Anna. Anna, we need to talk. Please come home. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. The nerve of her. As if she could wave a magic wand and undo everything. What are you gonna do? Kyle asked, glancing at the phone. I sighed. I don't know. Part of me wants to ignore her, but I can't avoid her forever. You don't owe her a damn thing, he said firmly. But if you're going to face her, do it on your terms. Don't let her control the conversation. He was right, of course. I needed to take charge of this. That evening, I texted Anna back. Me, I'll come by tomorrow. Be ready to talk. Her reply came instantly. Anna, thank you. I'll explain everything. I promise. The words churned my stomach. I didn't want explanations. I wanted her out of my life. But I needed to hear her say it. To confess, to own what she'd done. The next morning, I returned to the house for the first time since I'd left. Walking through the door felt surreal, like stepping into the scene of a crime. The familiarity of our home clashed violently with the betrayal I now associated with it. Anna was waiting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept. Mark, she began, her voice shaky. Save it, I said, holding up a hand. I'm here to hear the truth. All of it. No more lies, no more excuses. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said. You've said that already, I snapped. But you did let it happen. So, start from the beginning. She hesitated, wringing her hands. It started a few months ago. I was feeling disconnected from us. Ron noticed. I cut in, incredulous. What does that even mean? He's my stepfather, not your therapist. She flinched at my tone but pressed on. He reached out to me. He said he could tell I was struggling. I didn't intend for it to go beyond talking, but one thing led to another and you slept with him. I finished for her, my voice cold. Yes, she admitted, the word barely audible. The anger I'd been suppressing bubbled to the surface. Do you even realize what you've done? You didn't just cheat. You destroyed everything. You betrayed me, my family, my trust. I know, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I hate myself for it. I'll do anything to fix this. I laughed bitterly. Fix this? Anna, there's no fixing this. You made your choice. She looked up at me, desperation in her eyes. I love you, Mark. I do. It was a mistake, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me. I shook my head, the final remnants of my patience slipping away. I don't want your apologies or your promises. I want you out of this house, out of my life. Her tears fell freely, but I felt no sympathy. This was her mess, and I was done cleaning up after her. I'm seeing a lawyer, I said, my voice firm. This marriage is over. Her sobs grew louder, but I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control return. It wasn't much, but it was a start. After leaving the house, I parked a few blocks away and sat in the car, staring at the dashboard. The confrontation had gone about as I'd expected. Tears, excuses, desperate pleas for forgiveness. None of it moved me. But there was one question that still lingered, gnawing at me like a thorn in my side. Why Ron? Of all the people, why would Anna turn to him? I decided it was time for answers, and there was only one place I could get them. Swallowing my pride, I dialed my mom's number. She answered on the first ring. Mark, thank God. Are you okay? I've been worried sick. I'm fine, Mom, I said, though the words felt hollow. We need to talk. In person. Yes, of course. Come over whenever you can, she said quickly. I hung up and drove to my parents' house. My stomach churned as I pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of the front porch feeling tainted now. My mom opened the door before I even reached it, pulling me into a tight hug. She looked tired, her eyes red and puffy. I can't believe this is happening, she said, her voice trembling. Neither can I said, stepping inside. We sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, she broke the silence. Ron admitted it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me everything. And I prompted, my heart pounding. He said it started because he thought Anna needed someone to talk to, she explained. He claimed he didn't plan for it to go beyond that, but things got out of control. I clenched my fists, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. Out of control, I repeated bitterly. That seems to be their favorite excuse. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know what to do, Mark. I trusted him, just like you did. Her pain mirrored my own, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt for dragging her into this. But she deserved to know the truth, just like I did. Did he say why? I asked. Why he thought it was okay to betray both of us. She shook her head, her expression a mix of hurt and confusion. He said he was trying to help her, that he didn't think it would hurt anyone. I let out a bitter laugh. Didn't think it would hurt anyone? Are you kidding me? My mom flinched at my tone, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. What are you going to do? I asked her finally. She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. I don't know. I love him, but I don't know if I can forgive him for this. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had hoped she would be resolute, that she would kick him out and demand accountability. But instead, I saw the same uncertainty that had plagued me since this nightmare began. I can't stay here, Mom, I said quietly. Not while he's still in the picture. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. Just don't shut me out, Mark. Please. I didn't answer. I couldn't. As I drove back to Kyle's apartment, my mind was spinning. The affair hadn't just destroyed my marriage. It had ripped apart my family. The betrayal had woven itself into every corner of my life, leaving a mess I wasn't sure could ever be cleaned up. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let Ron and Anna's actions define my future. If they had burned the bridges, then I would build new ones they could never touch. It was time to stop reacting and start taking control of my life again. The day of my meeting with the divorce lawyer arrived quickly, though the hours leading up to it dragged like years. Sitting in the waiting room of the law office, I flipped through a magazine I wasn't reading, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. When my name was called, I stood, my palms damp with sweat. The lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Evelyn, greeted me with a firm handshake and guided me to her office. So, Mark, she began, settling into her chair, tell me what's been going on. The next hour was a blur of recounting the affair, Anna's admission, and the storm of emotions that followed. Evelyn listened carefully, taking notes but never interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward, her expression serious. I'm sorry you're going through this, she said. Infidelity cases can be messy, but they're not impossible to navigate. Let's start with the basics. Do you have evidence of the affair? I nodded and pulled out my phone, showing her the screenshots of Anna's texts to Ron and the timeline of suspicious behavior I'd compiled. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned them. This is a good start, she said, but we'll need more concrete evidence if you want to use the affair as grounds for divorce. Are there witnesses? Photos? Anything that ties them together beyond these messages? I confronted Ron, I said. He admitted to it, and Anna did too. Did you record either of those conversations? I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. No, I didn't think to. Evelyn gave me a sympathetic nod. That's okay. Admissions in person can still hold weight if the other party doesn't contest them. But if we can corroborate their relationship with tangible proof, it'll strengthen your case. What about the house? I asked, shifting the conversation. It's in both our names. That complicates things, Evelyn admitted. We'll need to determine who has a stronger claim to it, based on contributions and future needs. Are there children involved? No, I said, the word hollow. Then it'll likely come down to a negotiation or court decision. Do you want to keep the house, or are you open to selling it and splitting the proceeds? I hadn't even thought about that yet. The idea of staying in a house filled with memories of Anna and Ron made my skin crawl, but selling it felt like letting them win. I'm not sure, I said finally. Take some time to think about it, she said. But know this, your focus should be on what's best for you. Not her, not your family, just you. Her words hit like a lifeline, something to cling to in the chaos. For too long, I'd been stuck in reactive mode, letting other people's actions dictate my life. Thank you, I said, meaning it. As I left her office, a sense of clarity began to emerge. The road ahead was still daunting, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a direction. My next steps were clear: gather more evidence, prepare for the fight ahead, and start carving out a future where Anna and Ron were nothing more than a painful memory. They had burned my life to the ground. Now it was time to rebuild. The days after meeting with Evelyn were filled with a strange mix of purpose and despair. On one hand, I had a plan: document everything, build my case, and move forward. On the other, every step reminded me of what I had lost and how much my life had changed. Returning to Kyle's apartment after work one evening, I was greeted by him holding 2 beers and an apologetic expression. "You're gonna want to sit down for this," he said, handing me a bottle. "What now?" I asked, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "Ron's been calling me," he admitted. "Twice today." I didn't answer, but he left voicemails. "What did he say?" Kyle pulled out his phone and played the recordings. The first was strained, Ron's voice a mix of frustration and desperation. "Kyle, it's Ron. Look, I know you're close with Mark, but I need to talk to him. He won't answer my calls, and I just need to explain. Please, tell him to call me." The second was more frantic. "Kyle, it's Ron again. I really need to fix this. Mark's my stepson, and His voice broke, and he sighed heavily. "Just tell him I'm sorry. For everything." I clenched my jaw, the sound of his voice making my stomach churn. "Fix this?" I muttered bitterly. "There's no fixing it." "I didn't think you'd want to hear them," Kyle said, "but I figured you should know." "Thanks," I said, though the words felt hollow. I stared at the bottle in my hand, my thoughts swirling. Ron's attempts to reach out only added fuel to the fire. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry for getting caught. And as much as I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, I knew it wouldn't change anything. The next morning, I decided it was time to address the elephant in the room with my mom. She'd left me multiple voicemails since our last conversation, but I hadn't been ready to face her. Now, I had no choice. When she answered, her voice was tentative. "Mark." "Hey, Mom," I said. "Can we meet? I think we need to talk." "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "Come over whenever you're ready." When I arrived, she looked worn down, her usual warmth replaced by an air of sadness. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where countless family meals and conversations had taken place. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "For everything. For what Ron did. For how it's affected you." "It's not your fault," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But I need to know. What are you going to do about him?" She hesitated, her hands twisting together. "Mark, I love him. This betrayal doesn't erase the years we've shared, the life we've built together." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "So, you're just going to stay with him? Pretend this never happened?" "No," she said quickly. "I can't pretend, but I can't make a decision overnight, either. I need time." "Time," I repeated, my voice rising. "How much time does it take to realize he's a liar and a cheat?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Mark, please. I'm trying to process this just like you are." Her words stung, but I realized she wasn't wrong. Ron's betrayal had blindsided her too, and she was grappling with the same pain and confusion. "I just need to know where you stand, Mom," I said finally, "because I can't keep him in my life. Not after this." She nodded, her expression somber. "I understand." As I left, I felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. My mom's decision, or lack thereof, was hers to make. But my lines were clear. Ron was no longer family, and Anna was no longer my wife. The only person I could count on now was myself. A week after my conversation with Mom, I received an email from Evelyn. It was a follow-up on the divorce process, outlining the evidence I needed to strengthen my case. She encouraged me to secure financial records, communications, and any additional proof of Anna and Ron's affair. The sheer practicality of it was sobering. There was no room for emotion in the legal process. It was all about facts and strategy. With Kyle's help, I began digging deeper. I combed through old bank statements, credit card bills, and Anna's emails. At first, I felt like I was betraying my own principles, invading her privacy in a way that didn't sit right. But then I reminded myself, she had betrayed me first. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Hidden among her receipts was a series of charges for a boutique hotel on the other side of town. The dates lined up perfectly with days when she claimed to be working late or spending time with friends. I printed everything out, documenting each discovery in a growing file. It was cold, methodical work, but it gave me a sense of control, a way to channel my anger into something productive. Later that week, I decided to pack up the rest of my belongings from the house. Anna had offered to stay somewhere else for the night, and I accepted. The thought of seeing her again, of sharing the same air, was unbearable. When I walked through the front door, the house felt eerily quiet. The furniture, the photos on the walls, the little knickknacks we'd collected over the years, they all seemed like relics from a life that no longer existed. I moved quickly, boxing up my clothes, books, and personal items. But as I reached the closet in the bedroom, I froze. Hanging on the back of the door was the suit I'd worn on our wedding day. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about our wedding in weeks, but now, standing there, I was flooded with memories of that day. The vows, the laughter, the promises we'd made to each other. All of it felt like a cruel joke. Without thinking, I grabbed the suit and threw it into a trash bag. The gesture was impulsive, but it felt cathartic. By the time I finished packing, the house felt empty, stripped of anything that tied me to it. As I carried the last box to my car, I took one final look at the place I'd called home. Then I shut the door, locking it behind me for the last time. Back at Kyle's, I unloaded my things and collapsed onto the couch. The weight of the day pressed down on me, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The house, the memories, the pain, they were behind me now. The path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was beginning to move on. A few days after leaving the house for good, I received a message that caught me completely off guard. It was from one of Anna's close friends, Lisa. Lisa, hey, Mark. I know we haven't talked much, but I just wanted to say I'm so sorry about what happened. I only found out recently, and I had no idea Anna was capable of something like this. If you need anything, I'm here. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Lisa had always been part of Anna's circle, someone I considered more her friend than mine. Her reaching out felt strange, but not unwelcome. Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. I don't really know what to say. It's been a lot to process. Her reply came quickly. Lisa, I can imagine. I don't want to overstep, but if you need an ear or someone to vent to, I'm happy to help. What she and Ron did, it's unforgivable. The solidarity was unexpected. Part of me wondered if Lisa had ulterior motives. Was she trying to play mediator or gather information for Anna? But her tone seemed genuine, and I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. We exchanged a few more messages over the next few days. Lisa offered insight into Anna's behavior leading up to the affair, things I hadn't noticed at the time. She mentioned Ron a lot, Lisa said during a phone call. At first, I didn't think much of it. She said he was helping her navigate some personal stuff, but then it started to feel weird, like she was talking about him more than you. Hearing this made my stomach turn, but it also validated my instincts. There had been signs, subtle, but there, and I had ignored them, trusting Anna completely. Why are you telling me all this? I asked her finally. Lisa hesitated. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. You deserve to know the truth. And honestly, I'm furious with her. She betrayed you, but she also lied to all of us. I feel like I've been used. Her anger mirrored my own, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Thanks, Lisa, I said. I mean it. This helps more than you know. After we hung up, I sat with my thoughts, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in a way that was both illuminating and painful. Anna's actions hadn't just fractured our marriage, they'd fractured her relationships with the people around her. The next morning, I emailed Evelyn to update her on the situation. I included notes from my conversation with Lisa, as well as more details about the evidence I'd gathered. Her reply was encouraging. Evelyn, this is excellent progress, Mark. With corroboration from witnesses like Lisa, your case will be much stronger. Keep documenting everything, and let's discuss our strategy at your next appointment. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long, but I was building a foundation to stand on, a foundation they couldn't take away from me. That evening, Kyle and I cracked open a couple of beers to toast the small victories. To rebuilding, he said, raising his bottle. To never looking back, I replied, clinking my bottle against his. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I meant it. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and reflection. I focused on gathering everything Evelyn needed, from financial records to the documentation Lisa and I had discussed. I kept my distance from Anna, limiting all communication to text and only discussing logistical matters about the divorce. But Ron was another matter. He had been calling and leaving voicemails regularly, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored them, unwilling to engage. Still, his persistence gnawed at me. One afternoon, I got an unexpected call from my mom. "Mark," she said, her voice tight. "Ron's been asking about you. He says he wants to talk." "Of course he does," I said bitterly. "Did you tell him to back off?" "I tried," she admitted. "But he's insistent. He says he wants to make things right." "Make things right?" I snapped. "How does he even think that's possible?" She sighed heavily. "I don't know, but he won't let it go. I thought you should know." The call left me simmering. Ron's audacity knew no bounds, and it was clear he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. That evening, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him control the narrative anymore. If he wanted a conversation, he would get one, but it would be on my terms. I called him back for the first time since I discovered the affair. He answered almost immediately. "Mark," he said, relief flooding his voice. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I said coldly. "You've been relentless." "I just want to talk," he said. "Please, meet me at the diner on Elm tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything." Against my better judgment, I agreed. The next morning, I arrived at the diner, my stomach churning with nerves. Ron was already there, sitting in a booth near the window. He looked older, his face drawn and weary. "Mark," he said, standing as I approached. I didn't shake his hand or offer any pleasantries. Instead, I slid into the booth across from him and folded my arms. "Say what you need to say," I said. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know I screwed up," he began. "I betrayed your trust, your mom's trust, everything. I've been trying to figure out how to make amends, but I don't even know where to start." "Maybe start with why," I said, my voice sharp. "Why her? Why Anna?" Ron looked down at his coffee, his expression heavy with guilt. "I don't know," he admitted. "She came to me, saying she was struggling. We talked, and it just escalated." "That's not a reason," I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. "That's an excuse." "You're right," he said quietly. "There's no excuse. I don't even recognize myself anymore." The words hung in the air, but they did nothing to ease the storm inside me. "I don't care about your self-reflection," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You destroyed everything. My marriage, our family. You shattered it all. And for what? A fling?" Ron flinched at my words, his shoulders sagging. "I wish I could undo it," he said. "But I can't. All I can do is say I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," I snapped. "Sorry doesn't erase the betrayal or the pain." He nodded, his expression resigned. "I know, but I'm still saying it." For a moment, I just stared at him, my emotions warring within me. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make him feel the depth of my hurt. But another part of me was just tired. "I'm done, Ron," I said finally, standing. "Done with you, done with Anna, done with this mess. Don't contact me again. If you care about Mom at all, you'll keep your distance and figure out how to fix things with her." He looked up at me, his eyes glistening with tears. "Mark." I held up a hand, cutting him off. We're done." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the diner, the weight of the confrontation lifting with every step I took. Outside, the morning sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control what came next, and I was finally ready to move forward. The days after my final confrontation with Ron were oddly quiet. His calls stopped, as did Anna's. Even my mom, sensing my need for space, gave me time to breathe. It was as though the storm had finally passed, leaving me in the calm aftermath to sort through the wreckage. The divorce process moved forward steadily, thanks to Evelyn's expertise and my relentless preparation. Each document I signed and every piece of evidence submitted felt like another step toward reclaiming my life. One evening, Kyle and I sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what's next for you?" The question gave me pause. For weeks, my focus had been on survival, on getting through each day and dealing with the fallout. But now that the dust was settling, I realized I hadn't thought much about what came after. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I know I can't keep living in this limbo. I need a fresh start." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered leaving the city? A clean slate somewhere new?" The idea had crossed my mind before, but I'd always dismissed it as too drastic. Now, though, it felt like a real possibility. That weekend, I started looking into jobs in other cities, places I'd always been curious about, but never had the courage to explore. The process was daunting, but it also sparked a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in months. One afternoon, while packing up the last of my belongings from Kyle's spare room, I found a photo album I'd brought with me from the house. It was filled with snapshots of my life with Anna. Holidays, birthdays, lazy Sundays on the couch. For a moment, I debated throwing it away, but instead, I sat down and flipped through it. The images felt like relics of a different life, one that no longer belonged to me. When I reached the end of the album, I made a decision. I tore out the photos one by one, keeping only the ones that brought me joy, pictures of vacations I'd loved, memories with friends and family. The rest, I discarded. It was a small act, but it felt symbolic. I wasn't erasing my past. I was choosing which parts of it to carry forward. By the end of the month, I had lined up a job in a new city and found a small apartment to rent. Moving day came quickly, and as I packed the last of my things into the car, Kyle clapped me on the shoulder. "Proud of you, man," he said. "You're doing what a lot of people wouldn't have the guts to do." I smiled, the weight of his words sinking in. "Thanks for everything, Kyle. I wouldn't have made it through this without you." The drive to my new home was bittersweet. I was leaving behind so much, good memories and bad, but as the miles rolled by, I felt lighter. When I arrived at the apartment, I stood in the empty living room, taking in the possibilities. This was my space, my fresh start. That evening, as I unpacked, I hung one of the saved photos on the fridge. It was a picture of me, standing at the edge of a cliff during a trip to the mountains years ago. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky with brilliant hues of orange and pink. The image felt fitting, a reminder of how far I'd come and the endless horizon ahead. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. My marriage and the betrayal that shattered it were behind me. The future was mine to shape, and I was ready to begin again.